This is our setup for our AAA lab. We are going to configure AAA here in this Catalyst 9000. We are going to use this other device in order to connect remotely to the Catalyst 9000. So we will be able to test how VTYs behave with different AAA configurations. In the first part, we are going to configure a local authentication and authorization database. And in the second part, we will be using an actual Radius server. First, we're going to configure our VTYs and the console to use a line password. So let's test it. This is the IP address that we have in the Catalyst 9000. So let's connect to it. We will be asked for the line password, and we will land in privilege level 1. And now we are going to configure our local databases. We are going to create our local authentication database with the command username, and we are also going to configure our local authorization database. We are going to create an RBAC view. We are going to customize privilege level number 7 in such a way that some users are going to use privilege levels and some users are going to use RBAC views. So let's start by creating our view. Notice that we need to enter into root view mode in order to do so. So we're only going to create one view. It is going to be called experts. Given we are using inclusive, this view has access to all commands. Then we are going to customize privilege level 7 just to be able to execute this command. And finally, we are going to create our local authentication database. We are going to create 4 users. These users will have privilege level 15. This user will have privilege level 7. This user will have privilege level 1. And this user will be related to this view. Now let's configure login authentication. In this case, we're going to create this method list that we are going to call default for login authentication, that is going to rely on the local user database. So when using it, we are going to get asked a username and a password. And we are going to create this other method list that is relying on the line password. So we're going to apply these to VTYs with the command login authentication default, and we are going to apply this method list to the console with the command login authentication for console. So let's see the running configuration. Something funny happens with iOS XE. We are actually not being able to see the command login authentication default, most probably because this is the default command for AAA authentication. And given we are not using the default command in this case, we are able to see this login authentication for console. So let's test this with the users that we previously created. Now we are going to test the configuration. Remember that up to this point, we have only configured authentication. For VTY, we are going to use the local user database. That means that we are going to provide a username and a password. So in this case, we're going to use this user that is configured to use privilege level 15. So we are able to authenticate and we are acquiring an EXEC session. However, we are not being placed into privilege level 15. Now let's use the other user that we have configured to use views, which is an expert. And notice that we are not using any view yet. So this happens because we have only configured authentication. Let's configure authorization exec now. Now we are going to enable authorization exec. So we are going to create this method list that we are going to call default with this command, AAA authorization exec, that is going to rely on the local user database. Remember that the local user database includes not only usernames, but also the privilege level or the RBAC view these users are related to. So we are going to apply this method list to VTYs from 0 to 15 with the command authorization exec default. Notice that if we issue show run, we are not going to see this command because it seems that for iOS XE, it is the default. Now we are going to test this. Okay, now we are going to test what happened after configuring authorization exec. So let's enter with this user that is configured for privilege level 15. Now we are starting our EXEC session in the appropriate level. Let's test another user that is configured to use privilege level number 7. We can execute this command here. Now let's test a user that was configured to use privilege level number 1. Now let's test a user that was configured to use RBAC views. We are in the correct RBAC view. Okay, let's do some accounting now. Remember that we are not using AAA servers, so we are going to use this little command, AAA accounting commands local. So with this, we are going to store in the log whatever command we enter. So let's say that we issue show IP interface brief. So if we see the log, we'll see that we created a AAA entry that is logging the username. In this case, I don't have a username because I am executing this from the console. The privilege level that corresponds to this command, given this is just a simple show, this is giving a privilege level of 1. So let's test this entering through a VTY. Let's say that we enter with the admin user and that has a privilege level of 15. And let's say that I enter configure terminal. Then if I issue show log, I will see that user admin execute configure terminal, and this is a level 15 command. Okay, for the next part of the lab, we are going to break authorization exec. We are going to simulate a scenario where it is going to lock us out from the device. In this case, authentication login is going to perform authentication using a locally stored database created with the command username. And we are going to use or configure authorization exec to actually go and use a AAA server. We are going to simulate in this case that the AAA server is not reachable, and let's see what happens. So the command that we are going to enter in order to break the authorization exec is this one. With this command, we are telling this feature to only rely on this group. And if the servers in this group are not available, we are going to fail authorization always, basically. Okay, let's try and see what happens if we connect through a VTY line. Let's use this user with the correct password. Notice that we are not getting granted an exec session because the authorization exec feature is trying to reach this AAA server that is actually not reachable. So after some time, a timeout will be reached, and the method list will try to use another method, but in this case we only have one method available. So the authorization exec feature is going to reach the conclusion that it failed for this user, and eventually this connection is going to be turned down, and we are going to receive a message where we are going to know that the authorization failed. So with this test, we are passing the authentication phase because the authentication is based on a local database. But the authorization is going to be based on a remote AAA server that is not reachable. That is why, under these circumstances, the authorization feature may lock us out from our device. And that is why the authorization feature is not enabled by default for the console. In order to fix this issue, we could enter this command where we are going to rely on the local authorization database in the case that the Radius servers are not reachable. For the last part of this lab, we are going to add a AAA server. We are going to connect it. We are going to start it up, and we are going to configure the IP address. Notice that we have already configured a Radius group that is making reference to this radius 1 server, and we have configured this radius 1 server with this IP address. So we are going to use this IP address for the AAA server. In order to set up the IP address, we need to edit this file, etc network interface. We are going to uncomment these lines, and we are going to set up the IP address of this server to this one. This will be the default gateway, and we need to restart the server in order for this to work. Now we can ping the Catalyst 9000 from the AAA server. Notice that the IP address lives in this interface. However, this interface belongs to this management BRF. So just to be on the safe side, we're going to configure AP radio source interface gigabit 00, and the same for TACX source interface gigabit 00. This virtual appliance may behave as a radio server or as a TACX Plus server. If we wanted to customize it as a radio server, we will need to edit this file in order to set up the users and passwords. And in order to customize it as a TACX Plus server, we will need to edit this file where we can create TACX groups, users, and many other features. By default, we are going to use the key GNS3 for both types of servers, and in this case we're going to use these radius users that exist by default that have this password GNS3. And after checking all of that, this will be the AAA configuration using this radius server, taking into account that the server belongs to this group. Finally, we're going to test the configuration using these two users. So let's do a telnet, and it will be Addis GNS3. So we are receiving or being granted an exec session, and if we should show users, this is my user. That's it.